Hi, everyone. I'm Holly Karras, the J. Wayne and Dolores Barr Weaver, Chief Curator at the Cummer Museum, and thanks so much for your interest in our virtual content. Today, we're going to be talking about some works of art in the Cummer's permanent collection that use Florida as a point of inspiration. Arthur and Nina Cummer, the founders of the Cummer Museum, quickly became intrigued by the mystique of Florida shortly after they moved to Jacksonville from Michigan in the late 1890s. Arthur was an avid outdoorsman, and Nina became one of the early pioneers who studied Florida horticulture. Their love of Florida manifested itself in the beautiful gardens they developed along the banks of the St. Johns River. For nearly 60 years, the museum that bears their name and was built upon their collection of art has developed a special collection of the art of Florida. And today I'll be sharing some of these examples from our permanent collection with you. In 1929, Nina Cummer wrote, quote, "Could you find a spot which was not too cold and not too warm, not too wet nor yet too dry, where trees were evergreen, where the air was always freighted with the perfume of some sweet scented flower, orange blossom, wisteria, jasmine, or lily, where countless orchids bloomed on friendly trees, where palms spread gracious fronds on every side. Such a spot is Florida, and the dawn of each new day brings to the alert gardener opportunity to make further use of the glorious sunshine, the asset of this state," end quote. I'd argue that this statement holds true for both the artist and gardener alike, for the artist who came to Florida found great inspiration in the natural world. Let's get started. The earliest known European artist to set foot in Florida was a Frenchman by the name of Jacques Lemoyne. Selected by the French monarchy to accompany explorer René de Laudonnière to Florida in 1564, he was charged with documenting the people of Florida, the Timucua, and their customs, because the French thought they would have better luck in this strange new world if they could better understand the native population. He also captured the flora and fauna of Florida. No doubt it was a world of shock for the French explorers between the humidity and the landscape. Sadly, though, Lemoyne's original watercolors have been lost to history. But through the engravings of his contemporary Theodore de Bry, we have a glimpse, albeit a flawed one, of some of Lemoyne's work. Historians can argue the inaccuracies of the de Bry engravings, but the fact remains that they're the first visual records of this strange new world that we call Florida. Think of the Grand Voyages compilation of images like a modern-day illustrated journal, where each illustration is accompanied by a paragraph taken from Laudonnière's journal about the expedition. So here, his text talks about how, upon his arrival, he learned that the native Timucua had been leaving offerings and worshiping at a marker left by an earlier expedition claiming the land for France. Now, I'll leave it to you whether or not you think this is historically accurate. This is probably my favorite image in the portfolio. The Timucua killing alligators with ears that are about the size of a bus by ramming tree trunks down their throats and clubbing them to death. The text here goes on to say, quote, "These animals trouble them so much that they have to keep a watch against it at night and sometimes even in the day as if they were guarding against some dreadful enemy," end quote. Now, I'm not sure about you, but I don't really think this is the best way to attract people to come to Florida. Maybe with this image, you can see why historians question the validity of these images and caution modern-day viewers about interpreting them as the way things really happened when the French came to Florida. Many years later, Florida was still being explored by artists who sought to document Florida's flora and fauna. Among them were noted naturalist John James Audubon, who visited the area in an attempt to represent the quadrupeds of North America, which would be published between 1846 and 1854, shortly after Florida became the 27th state. Here we see Florida rats, male, female, and young, from 1841. This is an original watercolor from which the lithographs in the publication were made, and if you look carefully, you might be able to see Audubon's notes to the publisher along the margins. Because this is a work on paper and very sensitive to light, we can't have it on display as frequently as we would like. During the 1870s and 1880s, Thomas Moran came to Florida for a very different reason. He'd actually been hired by Scribner's Magazine to create images for an article on Fort George Island. However, Moran also had a not-so-secret aspiration to become a history painter. So what's a history painter? At this time, there was a pronounced hierarchy of art genres. So landscape, still life, and portrait artists were at the bottom, and artists who created monumental work showing great events from history were much more highly regarded. They were called history painters. Now, this is really a European convention that came to America, but in America, there was one great challenge for American artists who wanted to be history painters. While the Europeans had centuries of historical events to choose from the ancients all the way through to Napoleon, America was still a young country. So Moran decided to look farther back than Washington crossing the Delaware or Paul Revere sounding the alarm to one of the very earliest moments in the European-based history of the United States, the moment that Ponce de Leon landed on our shores. In this painting from 1878, Moran shows the conquistador with his troops supposedly surrounded by the wilds of Florida like actors perched on a dramatic stage. Now, while he did accurately capture the landscape of Florida, with its palms, oaks, and moss, he really didn't do such a good job with the Native Americans. Ponce de Leon would have encountered the Timucua, who were represented in those earlier works by Lemoyne and DeBry, with their great tattoos and those epic alligators. But Moran didn't have a visual reference for these early Florida natives, so instead he painted the Western Plains Indians with which he was familiar. Problem. Moran had hoped to sell this work to the U.S. House of Representatives to hang behind the Speaker's chair, and he hoped that it would also garner him additional commissions depicting the history of the United States. However, the House didn't bite, and Moran ended up selling this painting to real estate magnate Henry Flagler for the appropriately named Ponce de Leon Hotel in St. Augustine. This painting enters the Cummer's collection in 1996. Now, Flagler, for his part, played a large role in the development of Florida art. A savvy businessman, he saw great opportunity along Florida's east coast, which even as late as the end of the 19th century was remarkably undeveloped. Jacksonville was the southern terminus of the East Coast railways and the steamers, and it had developed nicely into a city of respectable size. St. Augustine, though, just to the south, was for the more adventurous sorts until Flagler decided to develop the town into a tourist capital with lush hotels like the Ponce. Now, what every good tourist needs is a souvenir, right? And the 19th century version of a souvenir or a postcard was an actual painting. So Flagler encouraged artists by establishing an artist annex at the hotel where visitors could mingle and pick out paintings of Florida to ship home. Among the first artists to work in Flagler's hotel was Martin Johnson Head, who arrived in St. Augustine in 1883. His view of the St. Johns River dates to the 1890s and captures the majesty of the Florida landscape. Now, he's an interesting guy, and we could do a whole lecture just on Head, here's a wonderfully talented artist who sold beautiful Florida landscape paintings to tourists while working for one of the largest commercial developers in the state, while also writing anonymous articles complaining about developers and tourists who were destroying the environment. So again, Head is complicated. Another artist who would be haunted by Florida's memories was Frederick Frieseke. Best known today as an American expat who spent time in Monet's colony at Giverny. As a young man, he actually spent 4 years in Jacksonville with his family. More than 40 years later, he would tell his tales of North Florida to his daughter, who wrote down the memories while Frieseke completed a charming set of 18 watercolors to accompany the text. The Cummer owns this set, and this image is called Pulling in Shark. Winslow Homer also spent time in Florida. He was quite a sportsman, and he visited the St. Johns River in 1890 to fish. But while on his travels, he completed several watercolors that show the surrounding landscape. Here we see the white rowboat, which was owned by the Cummers. 4 palms gently sway in the breeze while a small party of fishermen sit isolated against the great expanse of sky. Florida looks vast and largely uninhabited, with nature clearly dominating the tiny men in the boat. Herman Herzog made regular visits to Florida between 1885 and 1910 to visit his son, who lived in Gainesville. Intrigued by the lush landscape, Herzog created more than 250 views of Florida, including this small figure in a river landscape. It's similar to Homer's view of the St. Johns, with nature being depicted as the dominant force. But here, instead of the vastness of Florida's horizon, Herzog chose to depict the heavy denseness of Florida's wilderness. The final artist we'll take a look at from the Cummer's permanent collection is Eugene Savage. A large body of Savage's work was purchased by the museum in 2007. Although best known as a muralist, Savage created an exciting series of paintings and watercolors inspired by his travels to Florida in the 1930s. Here we see the Orchid Trail. You'll notice a beautiful Seminole woman gliding through the Everglades, surrounded by a veil of Spanish moss and admiring a flowering orchid. Savage really admired the Seminoles' relationship with nature and was lamenting the fact that they were being pushed farther and farther into the Everglades. He would write, "The white man's civilization has been their ruin. They exploit nothing. What particularly impressed me was that they live off nature, but instead of going out and shooting several deer and catching a mess of fish, they shoot or catch one, and they leave the rest. That's the way they conserve their resources. White man could learn a lesson from them." Thank you for spending time with me today. I hope you enjoyed this journey through Florida as seen through the eyes of artists in the Cummer's permanent collection, and I encourage you to wander through our galleries to see some of these works in person the next time you're at the museum. If you have a question or a comment, leave them in the section below and we'll do our best to get back to you. See you next time.